Hello and good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, in this session today we would be talking on understanding postmodernism. This is the fourth lecture in the series. We had a very vivacious sessions on the topic earlier also, and we believe that all the topics, all the lectures were very beneficial for you. So taking the series forward on understanding postmodernism, we have once again with us in our studios Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Ajay Verma is Associate Professor in Center of Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, JNU. So let's welcome Dr. Ajay Verma and let's try to grab maximum knowledge on understanding postmodernism. Hello sir, welcome to the latest lecture.
Thank you, Geetika. So hello viewers, as you would remember, we have already spoken about postmodernism, and we have also at length looked at what exactly we mean by modernism, to which in a certain sense is posted when we talk about postmodernism. In that line, we have already discussed that mainly for some of the major spheres of study when it comes to philosophy as a discipline are language, consciousness, ethics, and so on and so forth. So there were some very important changes, some major important changes in all these different areas of thought. And in past three lectures, we have been trying to look at how some of the basic presumptions regarding these three different spheres of inquiry undergo certain kind of change in postmodernism. So now we have if we talk about consciousness, as we have already seen that earlier notion of consciousness was that consciousness is something that is very much within our control, in the sense that we can always take out the things, the objects, the entities that we want to from the arena of consciousness. So the overall idea was that as if consciousness was some kind of an open space, some kind of a container where we could have thoughts at will, and where we could where we could put aside thought at will. So consciousness, almost as if in the kind of idea of consciousness that we were working with earlier, was an idea of consciousness where which was as if completely, so to speak, under the purview of our will. We could, and also, it was, so to speak, kind of transparent to us. Whatever was there in the consciousness was visible to us whenever we as if whenever we would invert our vision, as if inside, then we the overall idea was that we would be able to see what was as if going on in our consciousness. And the dominant idea was that the entire field of consciousness is kind of presented to us, is all the time there with us, and it's presented, it's present to us all the time. And then we saw how this idea regarding consciousness is problematized in different directions by different thinkers. So on the one hand, we find this idea of consciousness being problematized by some of the phenomenologists. Phenomenology, as a thought system, starts with Husserl. Earlier than that, Brentano also makes some important contributions, but as a full-fledged, robust system of thinking, it is developed by Husserl. So there, we saw how in a kind of changed scenario, consciousness, is essentially seen as, essentially viewed as something that is always intentional in nature, which almost as if comes before us or gets presented to us only when there is something that is intended by it. So all we have to start from in that sense is phenomena that we've already talked about it in our earlier lectures, but just for the sake of small recapitulation. and and consciousness being intentional in nature essentially. So it's always intended towards it's always sort of it can only be studied so far as it's connected to the phenomena before it. Of course, there from phenomenology. I mean, there are sort of further and further developments that keep taking place even after Husserl, and in the course of existentialist phenomenology. Even the idea of things having a fixed meaning for us, that is challenged because the presence of things almost so to speak, according to Heidegger, unfolds for us only in a kind of given existential situation. So it's not that objects come as if with a transparent self, with a transparent sort of with a kind of completely transparent ontology about themselves. Rather, objects are nothing so to speak in themselves, and sort of their presence starts taking shape only within the network of relationships that they have with not only the person who knowing around, but also the other things around. So and that in French existentialism, especially in Sartre, in the idea of meaning of things, even in the idea of consciousness as an entity, to be studied as an entity, that's there before us is problematized in a different way, because according to him, consciousness is almost as if recovered, retrieved in an act of negation. So when I see something, when there's something before me, and I know it as so and so, I recover, or so to speak, I retrieve my consciousness from this act, by recalling, so to speak, that even though I know this object, but I'm not this object. My consciousness, is only knowing this object. It's not defined in terms of what it's surrounded with, or it's not defined by the facticity of things around it. So the very idea of consciousness as something stable, as something out there, as something that's also all the time present to us, and something that sort of we were all the time in control of. That those kind of ideas are challenged in a big way, in changing scenarios after early 90s. And important another very important development in the area of consciousness takes place in the area of psychology as well. So earlier the kind of idea that we had about mind was that again the same kind of idea that mind is something stable. It's sort of thinking mind is an essentially a thinking entity, and of course sort of thinking cannot arise at all without the consciousness of it. So the overall idea, as we can very sort of clearly obviously see it in Descartes, thinking is very much a kind of is an obvious something that's happening within the consciousness. So it cannot be the case that we think and we may not be conscious of it, because there's the only thing about ourselves that cannot be denied, that cannot be unaccompanied by consciousness. So there could be sort of there could be sort of like all other things apart from thinking, apart from the acts of consciousness, could be bracketed, could be doubted, but the very act of thinking, since it's always accompanied by the consciousness of it, is something that cannot be denied, because in denying it would result in some kind of self-contradiction. So the kind of idea that emerges about thinking from there is that thinking is always a transparent, is always an obvious phenomena, is something of an obvious process, something that we cannot be not conscious of. But these ideas about thinking and about consciousness and about mind are challenged in a big way, especially in the area of psychology by Freud. So Freud presents presents a very different kind of the idea of mind consciousness, which is accompanied by much more complexity than the earlier ideas, the earlier notions of mind and thinking and consciousness. So now we can have a very brief look at how Freud problematized earlier ideas regarding consciousness and mind. According to Freud, the thinking mind, so to speak, is a very small part, is a very minuscule part of the entire gamut of consciousness. So according to him, consciousness is a very large arena, and mind, so to speak, is a very the thinking mind, so to speak, is only a very small visible part of it. So overall, this is a tip of the iceberg. There is much else under the water that is not visible to us. So similarly, thinking mind is only a very small part, minuscule part of the overall gamut of consciousness. A large part of it is which is actually not transparent, and not only is it not transparent, but also it hangs, according to Freud, in a very loose balance. So Freud conceives of consciousness as a very complex kind of an arena, and he divides it into three parts. One is first and foremost conscious part of the mind, so to speak, which involves the obvious thinking processes, of which we are aware, and we know we are sort of that those thought processes are occurring or happening inside the arena of our consciousness. But according to him, first of all, even if this arena, this part of the consciousness is visible to us, is viewed by us, but it's not under so much our control. It's not completely under the purview of our will. It's not that we could sort of bracket out ideas, certain ideas at will, and it's not as if we could empty our consciousness at will, as Descartes thought it was possible. So according to him, even the visible part of the consciousness is a result of certain very complex processes that always keep on going inside the depths of our consciousness, within those parts of our consciousness of which we may not be aware, which may not be immediately visible to us. So overall, what Freud means to say is that the part of consciousness which is visible to us is basically only apparent as symptomatic of certain other areas of mind, of certain other areas of consciousness, which are down there, within the beneath the visible arena of our consciousness, and there is so to speak no watertight compartment, which keeps these different sections apart from each other, isolated from each other. So there are certain very subtle influences that are already that are always going on from the unconscious part of the mind to subconscious part of the mind, and from subconscious part of the mind to the so to speak the conscious part of the mind. So even when we are thinking within the conscious sphere of our mind, even those processes are influenced by certain nether regions, so to speak, of our mind, and it's not completely at our will, as as clearly indicated in some of the psychological problems. I mean, say for example OCD. So there are certain kind of ideas which occupy the part of our conscious mind without our will. We want them to be out, but it's not so easy for us to simply bracket them out. So overall, he problematizes this idea of a unitary nature of the self, or unitary nature of the consciousness. He does not want to look at the consciousness as one complete unfractured unit. We have already spoken about it at some length. So this way, when we talk about consciousness, there are several. I mean, Descartes presents to us a very simplistic idea about consciousness, which is challenged in different directions, by different scholars. By different philosophers. Similarly, when we talk about, say for example, ethics, which is another very important area of study in philosophy, there again we find that earlier notions, pre-modern notions, were that there is single source of all ethical ideas, which is so to speak God or divinity, and there's already sort of kind of preordained notion of what is right to do and what is wrong to do, and they're supposed to be followed. And later on, after enlightenment, the idea was that through our rationality, through reasoning, we may reason out what is the right thing to do from what is a wrong thing to do, and in that. In that context, we had a look at the Kantian ethics, at some length. According to Kant, when I'm confused about how to act in a particular situation, then I should formulate some kind of a maxim, some kind of a principle about how to act in that kind of situation, and then next to that, I should see whether that principle that I formulated for myself, whether it's a principle that holds for everybody, irrespective of who it is. So it has to be such that it's not something for me. It's not conditional. It's not conditioned, by my existence, by my predilections, by my inclinations, and so on and so forth. So it has to be a principle of such a kind that should be equally applicable to anybody. So even if it were not me, even if it were somebody else, would it be good enough for that person as well? So in that sense, I should try and universalize that principle. And if it presents itself to me as a principle which is universalizable, which holds good irrespective of who is the person as a subject before it, then it becomes what he calls categorical imperative. So so overall idea here is that through the power of reasoning, we can always know what is the right thing to do, because and one of the hallmarks of reasoning is that it should be universally applicable. It should be able to it should be able to overcome the contingencies of particular situations, and therefore it should be such that it should be universally applicable. So now that idea of being able to differentiate very clearly between what is the right thing to do and what is not the right thing to do. That is problematized again by several philosophers. Major amongst them was Nietzsche. Nietzsche, as we saw earlier at some length, was highly critical of some of the earlier philosophers. He was very especially critical of Kant in this respect. According to him, when it when we talk about values, sort of if you look at Christian values, they are such that that they serve the purpose of a particular class, and then similarly, Nietzsche was very suspicious of most the philosophers preceding him, and according to him, many philosophies that we may come up with on the basis of what we call reasoning, quote unquote, are nothing but strategies that different philosophers have come up with, where they put themselves in a particular kind of position where they benefit from those strategies, and they present those strategies as internally coherent and as if quote unquote reasonable. But according to Nietzsche, if we look at the world, all our notions of morality, all our notions of right and wrong, so to speak, are kind of are disproved, because if we look at nature, it seems to be sort of governed by some kind of a brute force, where there is no place for weak, and what we see in nature, what we see happening in nature, absolutely challenges any notions of morality that were there in Christianity, and for that matter, according to him, since we don't find and it's very difficult to systematize what we see happening actually in nature, where the more powerful is always sort of is dominating the weak, and where we find that there is no place for survival for the weak. So any earlier notions of as such, we don't find any kind of a direct reasoning available to, if there is any reasoning at all, then probably something very, very distant to us, something that is not immediately available to us. There may be some evolutionary reasons, if at all, but not reasons in the modernist sense of the term, in the sense that we are reasoning beings, and we know about sort of reasoning of mind inside out, and therefore and thereby. Therefore, we can sort of we can know through reasoning what is the right thing to do, what is in the overall sort of interest of everybody and humanity as such. So all those notions are problematized by Nietzsche, and he gives a call for what he calls transvaluation of values, where he says that so some of the earlier values were such that they were against what we actually see happening in nature. Weak actually, as a matter of fact, there's no place for weak in the scheme of things, and and the earlier morality basically is such that weak who should perish are actually supported such that so that they could be so to speak so that there was somebody to dominate. So that there is somebody to suffer, so to speak, quote unquote. So, therefore, according to him, we should we'll have to revise our values. We'll have to give up our sort of earlier notions of good and evil, and therefore he sort of the title of one of his works is Beyond Good and Evil. So we'll have to sort of think of some kind of transvaluation of values, which goes beyond this so to speak transparent, stable, apparently stable dichotomies between good and evil, right and wrong, and so on and so forth. So this way, we saw that how some of the earlier notions, in the area of ethics, in the area of consciousness, mind, and so on and so forth. Some of the ideas that were more simplistic in nature. Some of the ideas which were sort of more unitary in nature. These ideas are problematized, but one major area that was there was the study of language, the study of meaning in language, and that we saw earlier that that is also problematized initially by the initial cue is provided by Wittgenstein. Earlier idea was that language is a kind of a stable system of signs, where there are things which kind of present themselves before us as they actually are in their true nature, and language as if almost has a direct correspondence with it, and is so to speak. So these are the two sides of the coin. So there, on the one hand we have the world around us, which is presented to us as a given fact in its totality. So as Wittgenstein says in one of his works, world is all that world is the totality of fact, and this is all there is before us. And language is fully equipped. Language just mirrors what is out there in the world. So language is fully capable of referring whatever is there in the world. So on the one side we have this physical given fact about the world. On the other side we have the world of language, where we have we have words which are fully capable of presenting a true reflection of the world as it actually is. So we'll see how this notion of language as a balanced equation between what is presented and how it is represented in language, how this is viewed as a stable equation, and how it is problematized in postmodernist scenario. We'll look at that shortly. So here we'll take a small break. Thank you. Welcome back, viewers. So before the break, we were talking about how language was viewed by earlier philosophers as a kind of a stable equation, on one side of which was the factual world, the world as was presented to us as a given fact, and on the other hand was language, which was fully capable of representing each and everything in the in the world, and how it was a kind of a balanced equation. But this comes under but first of all the problem that arises from there is that there are misunderstandings in language. It's not that that whatever we understand through language always is the actual truth about the world. At times some kind of misunderstanding does become possible in the language, and that needs to be, those confusions, those ambiguities need to be removed. So ambiguities, of course, are seen as something of anomalies, something that should be done away with. And for that, some of the earlier modernist philosophers, so to speak, come up with the idea that maybe there could be some way of gleaning out some of the malfunctions that become possible within the language, and that could probably be possible if we know the in-depth structure of the actual grammar, the in-depth grammar of language. And it was thought that maybe with the help of logic, which was thought to be some kind of an in-depth structure within language, if we know this structure well, then we may be able to thresh out true sort of instances of understanding from so to speak from the instances of misunderstanding of things. So early Wittgenstein works in that direction and thinks that he could develop some kind of mathematics, some kind of he could probably give us some kind of structural map of language, through which we could sort of know how language works, different nooks and corners of language inside out, and then there wouldn't be any scope of misunderstanding in language. But the problem there was that just like world is all there is that is given to us, similarly language is all that there is that sort of we can think of. What is the language sphere of language is all that we have in the name of thinking, so to speak. What to examine language, from an objective standpoint, we need to have vantage point, so to speak, outside the arena of language. But there is no outside of language, and since there is no outside of language, therefore there is no way of examining our language by going outside of it and developing some mechanism whereby we could objectively examine the language and could sort of could plug all the loopholes that were available for misunderstanding or malfunctioning to occur. So overall, the idea was, since there is no outside of language, there is no way of fixing it, so to speak. Then how do we understand the functioning of language? Understanding of functioning of language has to be done only within the sphere of language. It cannot be done outside of the sphere of language, because there is nothing outside the language. So in that sense, later Wittgenstein, taking a sort of huge turn from his earlier ideas, says that language is basically is sort of there is no one kind of a structure, absolute structure, which prevails beneath the visible structure of language. But instead there are only sort of there are different kind of language games occurring here and there, which only resemble with each other in part. So the overall idea was there is no overall center of language, no overall unitary source of meaning within the language, from where the meaning as if almost pumped in to into different words and then into different sentences and so on and so forth. So, later Wittgenstein presented this idea that language is there for the purpose of communication, and that function it serves well, and communication is there for people. So so language is there, has to be there for people to be able to communicate, and that we see happening without any hindrances. So there are sort of there are instances of communications happening here and there, and the only way to find out any structure from within the sphere of language is to see if there are any absolute similarities, if there are such structures which are common to all the instances of communications happening anywhere. And when we try to examine that, when we try to look into that direction, we find that there is nothing at all that is common to all the instances of communication, that is common to all the language games, and therefore there is no anchoring point, there is no center, there is no single source of meaning within the gamut, within the sphere of language. But the later philosophers like Derrida go further than that and point out that how the earlier notion of language was was of a stable system, where it was thought that language that the meaning of that the meaning of text resides in the source of it, in the sense that the meaning resides in the mind of the person who speaks, and therefore and since the language is completely within our control, whenever I have to say something, I say it without any hindrance at all, because a language is completely transparent, as transparent as my thought is. So when I have a clear idea of my thought, when I have a clear idea of what I want to express, then language immediately as if presents itself, hands over itself to me, and I in full control of it say something that I intended to. So a text therefore was a kind of a storehouse of meaning, was a network of meaning, which was in a complete balance, since the person where it's coming from was in control of her thought, and since that person was also in control of language, therefore it's a complete system, it's a complete transparent balanced system. We as a knower, I should intend to understand what was given to me for understanding, and so to speak, that's the end of the process. So what happens, according to the earlier model of understanding, there is a text before us. It has all that the writer intended through it, and it is all that there is to the text. There is nothing more, nothing less than than what the writer intended. So when I so overall idea is, when I say something, I intend nothing less, nothing more than what I'm actually saying. So that's the overall meaning that is contained in the text. We shouldn't go beyond it, and we shouldn't go we shouldn't capture less meaning than that was intended. So this was the overall notion regarding how to understand a given text. But Derrida problematizes this idea, and he points out that when we look at a particular text, then it not only has something that is presented to us, but that presentation becomes possible at all only because it is able to cover up much else around it. So overall idea is that a kind of presentation of something, a text becomes possible. A text, in sort of looked at this way, is not some kind of a unitary, unfractured given piece. So text here is such that in the very act of shaping itself up, it silences several other things in the background of which a kind of a unitary meaning sort of emerges at all. And Derrida's emphasis is upon looking at what he points out is that through the ages we have never thought about things that are unpresented in the act of being presented in the text. So, in a text, what happens is that there are sort of certain tensions which hang out, which hang in a loose balance, and what happens is sort of any text becomes possible when it suppresses, so to speak, the other side of certain binaries. So, say for example, the overall idea is that meaning emerges only from within the binaries. So, say for example, absence versus presence, femininity versus masculinity, and madness, as opposed to rational thinking, white, as opposed to black, wrong as opposed to right, moral as opposed to immoral, and it's an endless series of binaries. So what happens according to Derrida is that each time a certain presentation occurs, say for example something is said about what is evil or what is good, then it happens at all when certain sort of binary oppositions are removed from our purview. So for him it becomes possible, any text becomes possible because there is much else that is being sort of put into the margins. So when things certain things are put into the margins, there are certain other things that are thrown into the center stage. There are certain things that are thrown into the arena of visibility. So according to Derrida, we have hitherto never tried to never attempted to look at the things which get marginalized, which get suppressed in the binaries when certain presentations are made to us. So, say for example, if we if there's a text which tells us about what to do, or what is the right thing to do, or what is the moral thing to do, it is able to do so only when certain definite representation, certain interpretation of the text is privileged over several other possible interpretations of the text. So it could probably become clear if we look at some of the ways, so in which some of the earlier formats of texts. So say for example, if you look at some of the earlier texts, many of them come in the form of parables. Parables were basically nothing. Generally, parables were stories. Most of the time, very simple-looking stories, and in very simple ways, those stories seem to tell us, something, about the ethically right thing to do. And if you remember our school days, we would also remember that we would learn some of those stories. And we would also memorize the moral of the story. So there are sort of so many parables, there are so many tales, there are sort of Aesop's tales, where There are sort of simple-looking stories with each one of them, having a certain, moral to offer. But how does this moral giving become possible? Because we want to understand the symbols involved in those parables. We want to interpret them in one definite way, and we want to suppress, or we want to push into background, all the different other kinds of interpretations, of the text. So this is how this entire sort of morality, the moral of the story, becomes becomes visible to us, or sort of not visible to us, but this is how the moral of the story is presented before us. But according to Derrida, we are so much used to this kind of reading of the text that we never attempt to look at all those interpretations which get marginalized in order for a certain dominant view of things to come to the fore. So his overall idea is that we should, we rather than sort of looking at the text as a self-complete unit, as something directly given to us, as intended by the author, and something that is completely transparent before us, and something that we cannot be mistaken about, something something so to speak, obvious before us. So he says, instead of earlier sort of to the overall idea was that even if there is some kind of meaning which we haven't been able to understand, then the idea is to analyze it, to analyze further and further. So to look at the deeper corners of what actually has been given to us. But analyzing is the process of analyzing is very different from process of understanding how this particular meaning takes shape. What is the intention behind it? How sort of it is taking shape at all? How it is emerging from certain binaries? So to look at that overall gamut of meaning, the overall sort of processes, the set of processes that go into the shaping of a particular presented meaning, that is something what Derrida calls deconstruction of a text. So when we try to deconstruct text, what we do is we don't take the text as all that is given to us, but we rather look at all those the complete equation, where sort of certain something is a certain interpretation of things is privileged over its binaries. So overall idea is we should look at not only what has been, so to speak, said in within the text, but we should also look for what has been silenced. Within the presentation of that text. So if we look at only what has been presented, then we wouldn't understand how it is sort of marginalizing certain other kinds of meaning, sort of meanings that otherwise would be possible. Apart from that, also, there are certain other terms that are associated with Derrida's philosophy. Derrida, always celebrates not arriving, so to speak, at conclusions about a text. The earlier the idea was that there is a particular end to be achieved when we look at the text. It has a particular meaning to offer to us, and once we know that meaning that's been presented to us, that is, so to speak, the end of the story, as as we saw it in the example of the parables. So in the parables, the overall idea is that there is a certain moral of the story that you must understand, and once that moral of the story is understood, that's the end of the story. The end of the story, so to speak, has been achieved, and story, as a matter of fact, at that point makes its actual conclusion. But according to Derrida, meaning, is such a process that it cannot have any finality about itself, because there cannot be a complete given meaning. Meaning, sort of emerges, as just pointed out, emerges in any meaning processes, in any meaning process. Certain other sort of meanings are silenced. So a meaning becomes possible only when certain other meanings are deferred. So meaning only sort of becomes possible when there is this kind of a difference of certain meanings happening continuously. So if we have that kind of idea, if we have that kind of notion about how meaning emerges within the text by differentiating itself from in different ways from other possibilities, and by deferring sort of by pushing other kind of possibilities into the background. So this way sort of then it'll be kind of never ending process. There would always be a possibility of bringing to the fore certain other kind of possibilities, and which would also involve sort of silencing some other kind of meanings in the text, and so on and so forth. So for Derrida, there are no conclusions to be achieved when we try to understand a text. There are no conclusions being offered in any piece of writing, in any story, in any piece of literature. There are no conclusions that we should try and work out. As a matter of fact, somebody might say, well, then that means being ever confused about the text. That would mean that since we cannot arrive at any definite understanding of the text, that is tantamount to saying, that is equivalent to saying that we are confused about the text, and we would always be confused about the text in that sense. To that, Derrida says, well, the what he calls aporia, the movement of like a movement where sort of you have the meaning, but it's eluding your grasp. So a movement of sort of confusion, a movement of you don't know where you stand vis-a-vis the text. He says that meaning has been always seen as something of an evil, by philosophers, as something that should be discarded, something that has philosophy been always working against. So, to the contrary, according to Derrida, aporia, as such state is something that should be viewed as a sign of as a sign of true philosophizing. It's only when you start questioning the notion of unitary presentation of things, the notion of unitary unfractured text, that you actually start philosophizing about the text. So even in sort of Greek times, if you look at Socrates, what Socrates was doing in different texts of Plato, he's not in favor of giving or offering a definite understanding of certain ideas or certain concepts. He keeps on pushing the boundaries. Whenever you have certain definition to offer, he questions it further and further and further. And this is how he holds the conclusion in a certain kind of abeyance. within the dialogue. So according to Derrida also, this is the true way. This is the actual way of philosophizing about things. The earlier notion, of seeing confusions and ambiguities, within the text as something, of an evil, something, that shouldn't find a place within the text. Those kind of ideas are challenged by Derrida, and within that context he brings in also another notion which he calls logocentrism. Logocentrism is basically an idea that we have always privileged certain things over certain over their binaries. So basically the word logos is the idea of speech. So according to him, we've always privileged presences over things that become absenced, so to speak, by those presences. So say for example, we've always privileged speech over writing, because writing is supposed to be a copy of the speech. Speech has a definite, obvious, clear, transparent source from where it is coming, whereas writing sort of has some kind of ambiguity about itself. It is removed from its source. It is not immediately presented to us in the way that speech is, because its source is immediate to us, and therefore writing seems to be hanging in some kind of a loose balance, unlike speech, which is there, which is present before us, and the source of which is also present before us. So in such so we have been working with such systems, certain logocentric systems, where there are binaries, and where we have always privileged first of all, we create binaries, then we privilege one side of the binary over the other, and this is how presenting of the text becomes possible. So friends, this is all today we have time for. In the next lecture we'll talk about about a few more philosophers, namely Foucault, Baudrillard, and Jameson. So for today, that is all we have. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for your precious inputs to the topic. And dear friends, you can access this lecture the number of times you wanted, as we are going to upload this lecture very soon on YouTube for you. Keep writing us and keep watching the lectures. Our email ID is info.cc@nic.in. We would be meeting again soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.